Welcome to Giving an Answer, the show dedicated to defending the historic Christian faith. I am your host, H.E. Felder. Today the topic is the philosophy of history. And let me tell you that I have a special guest to discuss this. And my special guest is Brian Huffling. Let me tell you about Brian. Brian has a bachelor's degree in history, correct?
Right.
From Lee University. He has a master's of apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. We both went to school together. He actually has a PhD in the philosophy of religion, also from Southern Evangelical Seminary. So although we started at the same time, he's got his PhD, and hopefully I'll have my doctorate within a couple of months. So what did I miss out on?
You got most of it. I'm married to Lacey. My wife's also working on a PhD in science education from University of Greensboro. And I'm a chaplain in the Air Force at the Academy right now, and that's pretty much it.
Cool. That's good. That's good. Okay, so let's start out with this. How did you get involved in this topic? I mean, you've got your undergraduate in history, so you must like history.
I do like history. It's fun for me. I was considering getting a PhD in history. I really love ancient history, especially and medieval. The reason I really got into the philosophy of history is because I went to SES like you did to learn apologetics, how to defend the faith, and I quickly realized how important it is to do philosophy. And so while people can do history, I found out that a lot of people, or some people, especially in the philosophical community, don't think we can know the past or we can't know it objectively. And so that posed a problem in my mind because Christianity, the religion that we have dedicated our lives to, is an historical religion. It's not like other religions that are based in myth. We can't verify or falsify it. Christianity is intertwined between or with people and places and things that have happened in the crosshairs of history. The Bible says that this happened under this guy's reign at this town at this time and whatever. And so if we can't know history and Christianity is based on historical events, then what that means is we really can't know Christianity is true.
Right.
And so I wrote my master's thesis on whether or not historians can be objective in doing history. And so that's basically where I got my interest in the philosophy of history.
Okay. Well, I like to define my terms,
Okay.
just so that everyone knows what we're talking about. So let's start out with defining history. I mean, philosophy. What does that mean? What is philosophy?
All right, the word literally means love of wisdom. And so a philosopher is a person who, at least traditionally and historically, wanted to be able to be a wise person. He wanted to understand reality and knowledge and be able to make sense of all that. And philosophy studies several main issues. One is metaphysics, or the study of reality as such, what it means to exist. So as opposed to a biologist or a physicist or a mathematician who studies reality as living or as physical or material or as quantifiable or countable, metaphysicians and philosophers want to say, I want to know what it means to exist in general, not just what does it mean for this physical cup to be here, but what makes this physical cup the same as this physical table, as opposed to a cup that just exists in my mind. And so that's one aspect of philosophy. Another is epistemology, or the study of knowledge. So how do I know that cup's there? I see a cup, I can feel the cup, but how do I know it's there? What's going on in the process of my mind and the psychology and my senses to tell me that there's a cup there? And that's epistemology. And then another field is aesthetics, which is the study of beauty. So how do we know what it means to be beautiful? What is it? What is beauty? The philosophy of, or moral philosophy or ethical theory is another branch of philosophy that studies the nature of goodness, nature of right and wrong, and some will put in logic, the nature of a right thinking and how to appropriately make arguments and analyze them. So philosophy is just making statements about reality. We make statements about or with philosophy all the time. In fact, people generally make philosophical statements and don't even know it.
Yeah.
Statements about just the nature of reality. So we're all, to some extent, we're all philosophers.
So then define history.
History can be defined, and normally is defined in one of two ways. One is the actual events that did in fact happen in the past. That would mean that history would be comprised of things that we may or may not even know of, just whatever happened in the past. Others will say, no, history is the study of the past, and so history can only be about the record of the events that happened, whether they're artifacts, manuscripts, texts, or anything like that. But basically, history is just studying what happened in the past.
Okay. So now that we've defined our terms, what is the philosophy of history?
All right. So in doing history or doing science or anything else, we import certain philosophical notions. So for example, with science, scientists will say, here's how we do science, here's what counts as science, and here's the process, and here's how we can have the possibility of scientific knowledge. Likewise, the philosophy of history is not just here's how we do history, or not just doing history, but here's how it's possible to do it. Is it possible to know things in the past? Is it possible to make statements about the past? What about the nature of causality in the past? Is it possible for historians to be objective because they're biased and they don't see everything from a completely whole picture? And so, whereas history studies particular things in the past, that makes it where it's not a science, because science as such studies universals. So scientists don't study one person or one rabbit. They study things about a person because they want to learn about people in general. They study cancer not because they want to study this one person's cancer, but they want to make a cure for cancer, and they think that one person has a certain human nature, and by understanding that particular human person, we'll also understand his human nature and be able to extrapolate that knowledge to people in general. And so in doing history, history itself only studies particular things, this event, this one person, this one whatever. The philosophy of history does study universals because it studies the things that ties these events together, the nature of causality and how we know about these various aspects. So the philosophy of history, much like the philosophy of science or religion or anything else, deals with philosophical aspects of doing history. How do we do history? Is it possible to do it? And those kind of things.
Is this important to the average Christian, and if so, why?
I think so. Most people generally, I think, don't question, can we know history? They pick up a book on the Roman Empire and they say, this Roman emperor did this on this date and led this army to defeat these people over here. And we don't normally tend to question those kind of things. But as atheists and skeptics bring up these issues more and more, saying, well, we can't know the past, or we're biased, or we don't see the whole past, we're selective in how we choose documents to write history books on, or we can't observe it, or we just weren't there. As that becomes more and more prevalent, especially with the internet, Christians are being bombarded by this historical skepticism. And so it's ultimately and fundamentally important because, again, since we believe in historical documents being true, we have to be able to know what the historical events were. We have to be able to give a philosophical account for that, because the actual events would be historical, but the ability to know the events would be not just historical, but also philosophical. And so, yeah, we need to be able to defend the ability to know that Jesus lived, that he went these different places, that he was killed, and he arose from the dead. Because that is the cornerstone of our faith. We need to be able to explain that and defend that.
So how do we explain and defend that? How do we defend the fact that history is knowable, that the people who wrote history just didn't write what they wanted to write and just didn't make it up as they went along?
Okay. Well, there's a two-pronged answer to that. One is we have to analyze the arguments being made, and we sometimes can just reject them. So as one of our heroes, Norm Geisler, used to say, and probably still does, sometimes a question deserves to be answered, but sometimes a question deserves to be either refuted or rejected. And so some of the objections that people bring up against knowing history simply just don't really pan out. So people will oftentimes want to compare history and science. And they'll say, well, science is objective. We're using factual, empirical things, whereas history is really just someone wrote stuff down and this is their opinion. Scientists can observe their findings, historians really can't. Scientists can repeat what they're doing, and historians can't. But if we look at it in more detail, we can see that, first of all, scientists really are just as biased as historians. And actually, a lot of sciences can't observe what they're studying. They can't repeat it. They can't see the whole thing. They can't take into account all of the different variables. And so on one level, we just have to point out, well, there's some problems with your objections. They don't all pan out. They don't all really destroy the ability to know history. They don't really give us historical skepticism per se. So we can analyze the arguments and point out that they're really not very strong to begin with. And we can also give positive arguments for why we can trust certain documents. And so, for example, historians will tell us that we should go by such criteria as the criteria of authenticity and the criteria for best explanation. And the criteria of authenticity, these are all used to kind of judge between or adjudicate different theories. So, for example, if we take the assassination of JFK, we have at least two different theories, that there was one single person or there was a conspiracy of multiple people. Well, what we do is we say, okay, which account is more authentic? Criteria of authenticity would be things like, do we have eyewitnesses? Do we have multiple eyewitnesses? Do we have people who aren't necessarily sympathetic to the people involved? So if someone's wife, for example, says that, yeah, my husband's a nice person, he has a lot of integrity and character, that's nice, but she's probably going to say that because she's her wife, and even if it's true or not true. But if an enemy of a person says that person has high character or a very high level of integrity, that means a lot. And so eyewitness accounts or evidence from unsympathetic sources counts a whole lot. So enemy attestation or things that aren't friendly to the person necessarily is very good. Multiple eyewitnesses and those kind of things. Those are criteria of authenticity. Can we authenticate a source as being reliable or more reliable than not? Another one is the principle of dissimilarity. So Jesus referred to himself a lot as the Son of Man. Well, the early church referred to him as the Son of God. Well, that's a little bit dissimilar because we would think that Jesus, as trying to prove his deity, would refer to himself as the Son of God. But he oftentimes referred to himself as the Son of Man. And so that is actually an authenticating mark that these books, the Gospels, are legitimate because they don't have written down what we would expect them to. Or they have marks in them that are embarrassing. The disciples didn't believe Jesus, didn't understand Jesus. The disciples ran away at the arrest of Jesus. And these are authenticating marks that the documents themselves are more than likely not true. And then we have the criteria for best explanation. And that is, we want to see which theory, if we have two or more theories, so for example on the resurrection, we have the resurrection hypothesis or the idea that the disciples hallucinated. Okay, well, we have certain points that historians by and large agree on, namely that Jesus died, the disciples claimed and thought they saw him, they were transformed by what they thought was his resurrection, his resurrected body. Paul and James, who weren't followers of Jesus, didn't believe in him, were converted, and then the empty tomb. So any theory has to account for these data points, or what some call these facts or minimal facts. And so we have to ask which theory is more plausible, which one makes more sense, which has more explanatory scope, that is, which theory accounts for more evidence than the other, which one has more explanatory power, that is, how well does the theory explain the data, and then which one is more plausible or less ad hoc. Ad hoc just means made up to save the day, basically. It's Latin for to this. And if something's ad hoc, that means I just believe in it to kind of save my theory even though there's no evidence for it. So as an example, a lot of scientists today are wanting to push away the idea that the Big Bang proves that there is a creator of the universe, because our universe, according to them, is just one of an infinite number of universes, like the multiverse. Well, there's no evidence for a multiverse. Right. And so that's kind of ad hoc, or just kind of brought in to save the day with no evidence whatsoever.
So are there other issues that we need to be concerned about when it comes to the philosophy of religion? I imagine that's the biggest one, the fact that we can know about history.
Knowability of history and the objectivity of history. Those are probably the two major issues, especially for a Christian. Right. Because you want to be able to know that the New Testament and Old Testament documents are reliable, and you want to know that the people who wrote them down and the historians who wrote them down were objective, and they weren't just making up things to be making up things.
Do philosophers think that historians can be objective?
Some do, but the majority would probably say no. But one problem in this is they don't define, as you did your terms at the beginning of the show, they don't define their terms oftentimes. So when they say we can't be objective, it's not clear as what they mean by that. And so if objective means that you have to be free from bias, then you probably can't be objective. But the problem is that the way that people argue about this is pretty much self-defeating. So they'll say that everyone has biases or presuppositions. That is, everyone comes to the table with certain views that they hold to or believe. And we can't avoid that. I mean, we all have our biases, and that's true. But the arguer or the objector against knowing history says everyone has biases. And at least the implication of the argument is that in order to be objective, you have to be free from biases. And if no one can be free from bias, then no one can be objective. But the problem with that is that if we all have biases, that means the person making that argument also is biased. But he also seems to be making objective statements, like no one is free from bias, or everyone is this or that. No one can be objective. Well, those are universal statements. That's normally what we mean by objective. It just applies to everyone everywhere, no matter what our skin color is or our political background, our religious views. If we can say this applies to everyone everywhere, that's just what we mean by objective. And so the way we can be objective is by hanging our statements on objective principles. And those objective principles come out of reality. And so if we study logic, another branch of philosophy, if you want to call it that, is the law of non-contradiction. So for example, this can't be a coffee cup and not be a coffee cup at the same time in the same sense. And so those principles are true for everyone everywhere. And so if we're making our statements in accordance with these principles, we can judge between the different theories by pointing to these objective principles, and we can be objective.
I think one of the things that sort of bothers me about that, the whole objectivity issue, is that it removes away some of the best people who are in the best position to make certain statements. Give an example. Then a Jew could never write about the Holocaust because he's not objective.
Right.
A black person could never write about racism because he's not objective.
Right.
Everyone, to a certain extent, is writing about something because they feel a certain way about it. So if everyone had to be removed from the topic, then nothing would ever get written.
That's right. In fact, some people hold the exact opposite. Some cultures hold the opposite. So a great book, it's not about this topic, but it has a good remark in it, is Richard Bauckham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I think it's on page 9. He says that in some cultures, they think that the more a person is involved in a certain event or issue, the more objective they are because they have something at stake. They want to be able to give the facts cleanly and as true as they possibly can. And so this idea that we have to be removed, first of all, that's not even universally accepted. Some cultures think the exact opposite.
Well, and if what we're saying is true as far as, or if it is true that the person who is, has a stake or interest in it has to be removed, then doesn't that sort of disqualify the critics as well?
Yeah, because if they're writing a book against history,
right,
they've got something at stake in it, right? So then they can't be objective.
Right. So it applies to them as well.
Right.
Now, have you noticed, or is it true that whether or not history is knowable is sometimes skewed against the biblical documents?
You mean is that argument made just about Christianity and those kind of things?
Well, like for instance, there are documents, like for instance, we could read about ancient documents that reporting an incident in history that contradicts something that the Bible says, but they give the preference to the non-biblical documents.
Yes. So if the Bible says X happened and someone else says X didn't happen, a lot of people are inclined to believe the secular book, that is a non-biblical book, just because it's not biased in their religious point of view.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And it's really interesting because when we look at some of the secular views, for instance, like the Assyrians writing about their history, how come they're not biased?
Right.
How come it's only the Bible that's biased?
Right.
So it seems to be a double standard.
There can be sometimes. Yep. Exactly.
Are there any other issues that that apologists should be really, really in tune to when it comes to philosophy of history?
I think the main ones they're going to run into is, can historians even know history, and can they be objective? And we can take certain examples from our own experience and try to refute those claims, because these are the claims people are going to hear about from their atheist friends or skeptic friends that they work with or they're around. And they're going to say, well, you can't know Christianity is true because we can't know history. Well, as my wife pointed out to me when I was writing my thesis, our whole judicial system is based on history. I mean, we get somebody on the stand for murder or whatever, we have to have a jury that says this is what the guy did.
Right.
Well, when does history begin? Is it 5 seconds ago? Was it 5 years ago? Was it 50 years ago? Well, the whole judicial system is based on things that did happen. Well, that is history. So if we can't know history, then we can't even have our own judicial process. But these are the kind of things I think that come out more and more in these discussions about Jesus and knowing history. Also, I guess, about the biblical writers being biased. And many people will say that the only people who wrote about Christianity are the believers. Of course, if you believe that Jesus rose from the dead,
right.
you're probably going to be a believer.
Right. And not only that, you have people who were not believers who became believers. For instance, Paul.
Right.
So that sort of shoots down that argument.
Yeah, it does.
Because if their philosophy is that then no Christian could ever write, even if he was a converted Christian, then aren't you?
Exactly. Yep.
So it really doesn't hold water. Now, what's some of the resources you would recommend to someone who wants to know more about this topic?
Okay, there are several, and some are harder to read than others. One is
what's the easiest one?
I'm trying to figure out the easiest one. Logic as History is probably a good one. A Companion to the Philosophy of History and Historiography by Blackwell Publishers is pretty good. Ronald Nash, who's a Christian writer, has some anthologies about it. And if you just type in the philosophy of history, anything with Ronald Nash in it would be good. There are some Christian books that talk about it. I probably would start with Ronald Nash and his anthology of what people thought over the years and some of his explanations of what those thought. And that's called The Idea of History.
Okay.
Ideas in History, I think.
Okay. Now, any concluding remarks? Is there something that you think people should know that we haven't talked about or haven't touched on?
I don't think so. I think just being aware that these arguments are out there, having an answer, as your show wants to be able to prepare people to do, just go out and Google this kind of stuff. Make sure you're looking at reputable sources. Don't look at Wikipedia and things that we can't judge and stuff. But get some of these books, like A Companion to the Philosophy of History, and any introductory book to the philosophy of history would be pretty good. I think Michael Stanford has a good one. Just go dive in there. It's just all of it is difficult to some extent, but we just got to jump in there and do it.
Is there some things that they should stay away from if you're a Christian?
I can't think of anything. You can pretty much judge by titles of books and learn about the author. Might say about the author, where they're from, what they study, if they're an atheist or theist, and what their plan is to do. That's why I kind of point to Ronald Nash, his book, and the shorter book I think it's called The Logic of History.
Okay, and the reason I asked that is because I remember when I was a new believer, and I was watching something on, I don't know, it's History Channel, Discovery Channel, and take your pick, and it was the Jesus Seminar.
Right.
And they are these PhDs, these recognized authority on Christianity who don't believe in Christianity.
Right.
And I remember listening to these guys, and my face was sort of shattered for a minute there. I mean, it was rocked, because I thought that they were authorities and that they knew what they were talking about.
Yeah.
So I was mentioning that because if there's a new believer out there, I didn't want them to get blindsided by some of this stuff.
Probably a great book that's easy from an evangelical point of view is Norman Geisler's Systematic Theology, Volume 1. He's got a whole chapter on this issue and a lot of chapters on what he calls prolegomena, or things that we have to understand first or have a good understanding of before we can really get into the Bible. And then the second half of the book is about the Bible.
Right.
It's a thick book, but it's really good. Norman Geisler, Systematic Theology, Volume 1.
Believe me, I know that book very, very well.
Right, yep.
I've had to read that book and read it and read it.
Actually, I think now it's in a one-volume book. If you just look up Systematic Theology by Norman Geisler, it's in there.
Absolutely true. So, Dr. Huffling, I want to thank you for being on the show, talking with us about the philosophy of history, and that will end this episode of Giving an Answer. Be sure to join me again next time, and until then, goodbye, and God bless.
can find out more about Giving an Answer, as well as listen to other episodes by visiting us online at www.givinganAnswer.org.
For the 19 years.